If you're just tuning in to Civic Cypher, I am your host, Ramses Ja. Big shout out to my man, Q Ward, who is out and about. He is a man on a mission, and he is out changing the world, but he will be back soon, and we are going to get back to rocking in the free world for you. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Dr. Tekola, a sustainability scientist who has chosen to sit in with us to warn us to take decisive action to promote sustainability and to combat climate change. And so she and I are going to be having some more conversations, particularly with respect to kind of what's at stake and really what we can do about that. So if this is something that interests you, please stick around. If this is something that doesn't interest you, please get out of the way, because it seems like we got a whole lot of work to do. But first and foremost, we are going to discuss BABA, Becoming a Better Ally, BABA. Today's BABA is sponsored by Unknown Union, the fashion house situated at the intersection of meaning, innovation, and culture. For more info, check unknownunion.com. All right. I'm going to be reading from CNN, but first I got to ask you a question. Did you know that human and pet hair can be used to clean up oil spills? I know that this isn't a decidedly black thing, but since this is what we're talking about and there's ways to help black people, our hair curls up and we can definitely donate here. But everybody can donate. Basically, a hairstylist got the idea of using hair to soak up oil after seeing how oil stuck to the fur of wildlife. And turns out it works. All right, I read from CNN. In 1989, Alabama-based hairstylist Philip McRory had designed a prototype device that used hair to soak up oil, which was tested by NASA and found to function well. Together, San Francisco-based nonprofit Matter of Trust and McRory developed booms and mats made from human and animal hair. Everyday salons, pet groomers, and individuals send hair cuttings to Matter of Trust's San Francisco warehouse. The packages are checked for contaminants such as debris, dirt, or lice. Then the hair is separated, spread over a frame, and run through a custom-built felting machine to make the mats used to soak up the oil spills. It takes 500 grams of hair to create a 2-foot square, 1-inch thick mat, which can collect up to 1.5 gallons. And if you want to learn more about this, you can visit matteroftrust.org. The fact of the matter is that there's a lot of things that we're going to need to do to make a lot of changes. As we mentioned earlier in the show, a lot of times Black and brown communities bear the brunt of, the worst of climate change and environmental disasters, et cetera. And this is a small thing that you can do to help out. Once again, matteroftrust.org. Moving on. Now let's talk about sustainability, Dr. Tekola. Now, when we were talking before the show, you sent me a text and you says, hey, we need to really get the word out about all these things that are going on in the country, these storms and fires and so forth. And you also texted me something that stood out. You said it's gotten really bad and there's a lot at stake. So let's talk about what's at stake.
I'd say what's at stake is our future and its ability to live on this planet. And so what we're seeing is, as the hotter it gets, what will change is like agriculture zones. So for example, in the United States, we have the breadbasket. If the breadbasket moves up to Canada because of the heat and the temperature, the increased temperature, then we're no longer a wheat exporter. It creates huge national security, huge economic implications. But more importantly, I would say, like the risings of the tides, which, the ocean will continue to rise as the glaciers continue to melt, which means that the coasts will not be
Florida's
safe.
Gone. Yeah.
Florida's underwater.
Yeah.
Parts of California are underwater, and New York. And when we're looking at this, these are the most populated places in the world is the coast. And so if the coasts go underwater, we're talking about mass evacuation, and who gets left behind? Poor people. And that oftentimes means our communities. And so, not to mention, how are we going to grow food? Where are we going to get water? Here in Arizona, Nevada, and, Southwest California, We all get our water, specifically Vegas, Phoenix and LA get a huge component. In Phoenix is 40% of our water from Lake Mead, which is the water from the Colorado River behind Hoover Dam. Lake Mead we're about to run out. I was just there a few weeks ago and I saw the impact, and, I was just there 10 years ago. And to look at the difference in 10 years, you shouldn't be able to see that.
For folks that haven't been up there, because I was just up there recently myself, and you can see the water line. You can see how much water is gone. And as someone who's lived here and gone to Vegas since I was, let's call it the past 20 years, I'm used to seeing that water line at or approximately at the normal level. And now it's so far gone. It's really scary. So for folks who don't make it to this side of the country, it's important for you to know that this is not an exaggeration. We're not making this up.
Phoenix, LA, Las Vegas. Can you imagine if these cities ran out of water? Oof. And we're talking about this is our reality in the next 5 to 10 years if we do nothing. And in fact, it's actually going to be sooner. If by 2025 we don't do something, that means we'll lock in, and basically by 2030 will be past the point of return. And that's the thing about climate change. And that's actually, when you look at human psychology, we tend to procrastinate about things that aren't directly in front of our face. So, if it's a slow boil, like they say with frogs, right? You put a frog in a boiling pot, they're going to jump out, but you turn up the heat slowly and you can willingly cook them. And that's literally what's happening to us in this world.
Good.
So one of the things, is that the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change. These are the best scientists from around the world that put out, reports every year. And they have in 2019, they said that 2030 is our tipping point. And if we do not peak carbon emissions, by 2030, that will be the point of no return. So we, only have 7 years left really to, avert this crisis as we know it. And if we don't by 2030, then we really have to start looking at how do we survive the apocalypse. But we're already starting to feel that. Like I said, like the Southwest water's future is not guaranteed. And what we're seeing is that instead of you would think Lake Mead drying up would be enough. If, the Southwest running out of water would be enough for behavioral change. And what we're seeing is not that. For example, we're in tier 2 shortage of water, which is the federal government is telling the Southwest they have to come up with plans to reduce their water. And recently when, they had until like this spring to come up with plans, and Nevada and Arizona were teamed up and were like, we have a plan, tell California to cut all the water. And California was like, wait, hold up. That's not fair. So we're not actually being solution oriented. We're not being conducive. We have people like Christian Cinema that be like, I don't like that California gets more water than Arizona. And it's like, that's beside the point. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's not debate who gets more. Let's actually talk about how do we change our behavior so that we avert this crisis of the Southwest, having to evacuate.
Right. Now, there's two things that you said. And I know we're kind of focused a little bit on the Southwest right now, but I think that kind of shows that mentality that you described, that people are not really taking it seriously. So if you don't live in the Southwest, bear with us for a minute. You mentioned the breadbasket and how there are fiscal implications and potential food insecurities if, we don't combat this issue right now, right? So now we're talking about people's money, and money typically makes their ears perk up, right? Or if we're talking about food security, those are things that people might worry about, because it doesn't matter how much money you have if you can't eat. You can't eat them dollars, trust me.
Yeah.
So, I want us to hold that in one part of our minds. The other part of our minds, I want us to imagine, you don't really have to imagine because it's a real thing, but in the same state, you mentioned Kirsten Cinema in the state of Arizona, where there is a water shortage and a water crisis. Let's be honest. Let's call it what it is. They're actively building a water park. You read about this, right? Yeah. So you can see how the intersection of corporate interests and sustainability, that the alarming kind of intersection typically falls on deaf ears when it comes to politics, because politicians require money to remain in office, and then the money comes with favors and strings attached and so forth, and then we, the people, end up paying the price for it. And again, we've talked a bit about poor people, bearing the brunt of this, but the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of people that live in the Southwest, in Vegas, and in Southern California, and in Arizona. And for a second, let me just mention this. For people that think that just because California is on the ocean that they're going to be fine, it doesn't work that way. Yep. We need fresh water, that we're not saltwater creatures. But anyway, I just wanted to make sure that I interjected that, because people really need to understand the mentality of our elected officials so that we know how to hold them responsible for our lives in the future of our planet and the future for our babies. It's funny, before the show, you were, you saw my son, in the studio, and you know that I definitely want a world for him to grow up in and have his own children. And so I'd imagine that most people feel the same way. So.
This is Maggie B. Noen, and we'll be right back with more Civic Cypher after a quick break.
I'm Donald Trump.
And I'm Joe Biden.
And there's only one thing that could bring me and Sleepy Joe together.
Come on, man. Don't corn pop me.
That's in support of the Independent Riot podcast, where they interview independent thinkers on controversial ideas like the dangers of voice cloning technology.
But is it available on any gramophone machine, Donald?
Yes, Joe, it is. And it's bigly important. Many people are saying, that's the Independent Riot podcast. Not right, not left, just real. Subscribe now.
Or I'll sock you in your mouth, Jack.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you talk about the politician's mentality, it's just ego and greed. And it's ego to the point of, it can really cause us to for us all to die, because these people thought they could put a water park at a tier 2 shortage. It's just, at this point, it's like, how can you be so arrogant? But as you can see, it's also, and this is part of my research and why I connected decolonization and climate change, because it's this type of colonial thinking of this man over nature, of this domination over nature, just like dominating over people of color. And it's this belief that, we can just solve it. And so what we hear from a lot of the Republican legislature, from a lot of people, is like, we got the ocean, we can just desalinize. Well, the problem with desalinization is it's incredibly expensive. Right now, we're paying cents per gallon. When you look at desalinization, we're going to be spending dollars per gallon. And some people, the rich, might be able to afford that. But what happens to people who can no longer afford water because that was the planned desalinization? Not to mention that a lot of these plants break. Not to mention in states like Arizona, we don't have a coast. And they're talking about, we're just going to make a deal with Mexico. Like, we don't have the greatest relationship with Mexico. Sure. Have you actually talked to them? You can't bank our future on these, political negotiations that haven't even been started. Sure. So it is scary. But I also want to talk about the other side. One of the things that I've heard criticism of climate activism is that, they say Martin Luther King had a dream, but climate activists only describe the nightmare of the future, right? And so we also have to look at the bright side, the possibility of opportunity. Okay. Naomi Klein has a book called This Changes Everything. And really, climate change does change everything. But instead of looking at it like, what are we going to do? This is so terrible. We can look at an opportunity. This is an opportunity to address existing inequities, address redlining, address all of these issues our communities already had, if we really look at the opportunity. And so there's 2 important bills that actually passed. Okay. The Inflation Reduction Act and the Jobs and Infrastructure Bill. Okay. Both of these unlock billions of dollars that go into, one, green jobs, which on average, green jobs pay more than oil jobs. They're healthier. They don't have as much toxic exposure. And then they also oftentimes are union jobs that don't require a college degree. Okay. And so this can actually have a material benefit to our communities. And when you look at oil versus renewable energy, since we have to build the infrastructure for renewable energy, they make 3 to 4 jobs per every 1 job in the oil industry. So when we talk about the jobs versus environment false dichotomy, well, if we want to play that game, renewable energy creates more jobs.
Sure.
And so with these two bills, they really unlock all sorts of possibilities. Now, in particular, another important thing is Biden had passed what's called Justice 40. It's an executive order which says that 40% of these environmental and similar social bills 40% of that funding has to go to communities of color. Okay. And so when we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, that's $370 billion. This is bigger than the New Deal. And 40% of that has to go to our communities. Okay. So when we look at the decades of disinvestment, the Inflation Reduction Act, if we seize the opportunity, if we hold government accountable, if we get our cities to apply for this funding, if we get our communities to apply for this funding, we could really transform our cities, and it will be an opportunity to change these historical inequities. And so I also think that we should talk about the possibilities if we address, if we have what they call a just transition, where we make sure no one's left behind. It can actually put communities of color on a better outlook in the future.
Okay. Now, I want to circle back to that in just a second, because I feel like you can give us some pretty profound advice in terms of what we individually can do. You have studied, you've seen it all, you know it all. Most folks they wake up, they go to work, they get their kids from school, they go home. And like you said, it's such a far away problem for most people. But because you've seen it and because you know what can be done and what happens if we don't, I'd love to get your advice for the every man and every woman, or every person, I should say, that like what we can do in our immediate lives, but beyond recycling and whatever. So first, before we get there, I do want to share something that I got from Vox. Okay, so Vox.com, record heat, normal, it's hot. All right. That's from Laura Ingraham on her Fox News show. After all, we're in the middle of a season called summer. Now, the thing is, she was being facetious. She was like, oh, everybody's complaining about it's hot. It's summer, right? She's not understanding, or she's trying to make light of the fact that it is a record-breaking July, the hottest July on record. Anyway, the fact checks suggest that more than 3,000 temperature records were shattered in the U.S. for the month of July alone, something scientists say would be virtually impossible without human-caused climate. Okay, let's go to forest fires. Nature naturally burns itself off every 11 years with natural disaster forest fires. This comes from Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, who's a Republican from Oklahoma. This is a forest fire. All right, now let's fact check him. It says the severity of wildfires, such as the historic blazes in Canada this year, are fueled by complex conditions, including forest management and drought primed by climate change. Okay. All right, so let's go to the stronger hurricanes. All right. Just a part of life. This is something that is a fact of life in the Sunshine State. This comes from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He said this in a Fox News interview. He goes on to say, I've always rejected the politicization. Did I say that right? Politicization, that's what it says, of the weather. But the fact check suggests that climate change drives the warming of ocean waters, which provide fuel for more devastating hurricanes and typhoons. All right, so let me go on to the next one here. More Americans are impacted by climate change. 62% of all voters recognize climate change is caused by human activity, according to a Gallup poll from this spring. Yet climate change denial is not only alive and well in the GOP, it's become a lot more insidious and polarizing, said John Cook, a University of Melbourne researcher who has tracked the path of climate disinformation online using artificial intelligence. The GOP's only climate policy is actually bad for the environment. When Representative Bruce Westerman, who was a Republican from Arkansas, first proposed the Trillion Trees Act in 2020, environmentalists said the bill would significantly increase logging across America's federal forests, convert millions of acres into industrial tree plantations, increase global carbon emissions, increased wildfire risk, and harm wildlife and watersheds. The idea was a wolf in sheep's clothing, effectively giving loggers more allowances as long as they planted seedlings, which are decades away from delivering climate benefits. But the GOP has come to champion this idea as their climate plan. So it's important to know that there are people who may even pretend to care about this issue, and they may put something together that sounds good. Trillion trees, if that's what you name it, it sounds great. A trillion more trees, hey, we're good, right? But when you peel back a couple of layers, as I mentioned, it's really just expanding logging, and they do want to plant more trees, but it's just not realistic because the benefit of those trees, we're going to sink a lot further before we get the benefits of those. And right now we need to be climbing out of the ditch. We sink any further that we may hit that point of no return that you mentioned. So we got a couple of minutes left. I do want to ask you what is it that sort of the every person can do with the information that we've discussed on today's show?
So a few things. I'm not going to talk about individual actions because, frankly, I think we're beyond that. Okay. For me, the individual actions I take is more of part of my personal ethic, and helps me be conscious of the environment that I'm in. Sure. But really, when we look at, we need political action. And so when we think about voting, when we think about talking to our legislature, we need to make climate the number one issue. Okay. We need to make sure that our politicians realize that if they're going to be an ostrich with their head in the sand, if they're going to be the emperor who has no clothes and talk about climate change doesn't exist. Meanwhile, communities in Alaska are already having to be relocated because they're melting. Yeah. So you can't really deny that. And if you do, again, you can't be seen as politically feasible. And so we have to make that reality, right? We need to strengthen our democracy by ensuring that communities, that politicians know that this is one of our core issues. And then, there's other things that you can do in terms of ensuring, ensuring that we hold corporations accountable. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. There's a lot of different organizations, whether like the Sunrise Movement or other groups like Extinction Rebellion. We really need to hold these corporations accountable. And actually on September 17th, which is during Climate Week in New York, there's going to be a huge mass protest. I'll be there. If you're in New York, you should be there if you're in the area. And we're really trying to, again, hold our politicians responsible, let corporations know more. But it's really important for us to be aware. So increase our awareness, and then also make sure that we're holding our governing and corporations accountable. Well,
that is sound advice. I appreciate you coming to share that with us. Obviously, this is the most important issue. It doesn't matter who's black and who's white and whatever if there's no planet and we can't survive on it. So, vote accordingly. I like that advice. If you feel so inclined, please, share any ways that people can connect with you virtually, social media, anything like that, or any sort of websites that people can go to get some more information.
Yeah, for sure. So a few different ways. If you want to connect with me personally, my Instagram is Dr. Sarah Tekola. If you're interested in, I am an environmental justice consultant. My company is Addis Alum Consulting. So I help organizations improve their environmental justice analysis. And then finally, I think just like I said, make sure that you pay attention and get involved in what's happening in your neighborhood.
All right. And until next week, y'all. Peace.